Hello, my name is Janet Schmidt. I've created this video as an assignment for a cybersecurity class that I'm taking through Metro State University with Professor Faisal Kaleem. Hopefully you find this video interesting, but please bear in mind the video is solely for educational purposes, mostly mine, and I'm not liable for any damages that could be caused by using these demonstrations. So today we're going to be talking about behavioral biometrics. We'll walk through a bit of an introduction, a little history. We'll talk about some actual use cases where this technology is being used, and then also review some benefits and challenges. So when we first start talking about behavioral biometrics, it's important to think about how it really fits into the authentication scheme of things. So as we all know, authentication can really happen through three methods. One of those is using something you know, which is pretty old school, so a password, a PIN, or an answer to a secret question. Then you might layer on something that you have, so a hardware security key, an authentication app, or a card reader. Many of us also use our phones as that secondary authentication. And then finally, it's using something that you are, a fingerprint, a face scan, or a behavioral trait. And within all of these things, that final piece, that behavioral trait, is really where behavioral biometrics comes in. So of all that, it's a very small slice of the authentication pie, but definitely an important one. So behavioral biometrics does fall under the umbrella of biometrics. Biometrics being the automated recognition of individuals by means of unique physical characteristics, so typically for the purposes of security. Now we're all pretty familiar with these. We use our fingerprint to access our phones or even some of our accounts. Facial recognition, likewise, we can access our phones that way. And then retinal scans are something that we've seen in books and the media for a very long time, so nothing new. But where behavioral biometrics comes in is really behaviors that are unique to each person. So a certain person's way of speaking or moving really tells us a lot about that person. So before we get too much into behavioral biometrics and what it is, I'd like to talk a little bit about its history, simply because it's not as new as one might think. It's really been around for quite some time, and I think as humans, we actually use this somewhat intuitively in our daily lives. So one example would be from the 1940s during World War II, where telegraph readers could recognize specific patterns of the sender. So if a bad actor was attempting to impersonate that sender, the recipient might notice that the pauses between their messages were a little bit different, or even the cadence with which they typed, allowing that recipient to identify the fraudster and then act accordingly. There was also a short story called Dog Walker by Orson Scott Thomas. This was originally published in 1989, so upwards of 30 years ago, about a team of criminals who were trying to pull off a heist and essentially rob a very wealthy target. They used psychological profiling to finally determine his 15-character password, but in the end they still failed to access the goods. And this was simply because the wealthy gentleman had this very fear of being robbed, and so every time he accessed his assets, he would always type in his password incorrectly first, and then would type it in correctly the second time. So the system was able to recognize the bad actors when they tried to access it simply by typing in the password correctly the first time. Um, so just kind of some interesting background on behavioral biometrics. So now we'll just move into more of behavioral biometrics in action, we'll call it. So there are several ways that behavioral biometrics can be used. One of those is through kinesthetics. So basically the way that you hold your body, your posture, your gait can be very unique to you. If you've ever been in a concert hall or a theater with a friend, and you were somehow separated and you saw the profile or the outline of your friend walking through the crowd, even though you can't see them, you can only really see their sort of shadow or their figure, you can tell it's them simply by the way that they walk. Um, it might also be in the way that you handle your device. So phones might have sensors at the side. You might always hold your phone from the top or the bottom, or um, just in the way you overall hold that device. And then there's voice recognition, which is nothing new. I think this one's a pretty much a little bit more familiar to a lot of people, but basically thinking about the way that people speak, the patterns, where do they pause, where do they speed up. Um, some people might be very expressive in the way they speak, and some people very monotone. And then even the sound variations or how you pronounce certain words can be very key to you and how you speak. And then finally, gestures. So keystroke dynamics might measure the speed at which you type. It might also measure the words that you often spell incorrectly. So if you have that word that you're always mistyping and then having to back up and retype, that would be something that might become part of your profile. And then you have your mobile interactions. So basically the gestures that you might use in accessing and your swiping patterns. And then of course your cursor movement. So how quickly or frequently do you move your mouse across your desk? So how behavioral biometrics works is that it first builds a profile on you. So these algorithms are constantly collecting data in the background and categorizing the many ways that you interact with your devices, whether it be your phone or your computer or your tablet or, whatever it is that you're using. And so it analyzes and builds these micro patterns, and it will update your profile over time. So what this means is that your profile will actually age with you, meaning that it will constantly be changing but also constantly be updating so that it's fully reflecting you in that moment. So then when it comes to authentication, when you log in, the algorithm assigns you a score based on how closely you match previous patterns. Now, the administrator of whatever account you're trying to log into might set it so it's a little stricter or a little bit looser, which could potentially result in some positive or negative matches, but that's something that we'll get into a little bit more when we talk about challenges. So finally, what this results in are these layers of security that can really be used in combination with other methods like passwords or passcodes to create a stronger multi-factor authentication approach. So now we're going to watch a quick video on YouTube where basically the users are demonstrating the um, the behavioral biometrics. So the authenticated user will type in the passcode and be able to access the phone. They'll then pass it to another user who types in the exact same code but is denied access. So let's watch. Okay, so that was a very simple but elegant demonstration of how behavioral biometrics works and how simple it can seem, but it's very complex in the background. So there are several applications that one might use behavioral biometrics for. One is to prevent user substitution. So again, this is constantly working in the background, verifying that a user is who they claim to be, and it can continue to authenticate that person even throughout a session as it collects data. It can also prevent against insider threats. So this is where it confirms an authorized person is actually using the system, whether they're from within, maybe they just shouldn't be in that particular system. It also helps to prevent against phishing attacks because it can recognize those invalid logon attempts by bad actors. Also works against identity fraud. Personal information and passwords can be stolen, but it's very difficult to imitate physical movement and patterns. And finally, it can ensure that individual licenses are not shared by many, and just ensuring that licensing abuse doesn't occur. And these are just 5 examples. There are many, many more. These were just some that I pulled. But certainly if you Google it, you could find some more. So generally, biometric technologies are considered by experts to be one of the most secure methods of protecting your accounts. That was a quote from Expert Insights. It was one of the articles that I read to get ready for this presentation. If you're interested in other articles that I referenced, you can find that information on the final slide of the presentation. All right, let's get into a couple of use cases. So the first use case is a call center. I don't know if anyone watching has worked in a call center. I have, and it's definitely a place where a lot of fraudulent activity can occur. People might call pretending to be somebody that they're not, and sometimes it's with the best of intentions. Maybe they're trying to help a relative, but in the end, it's still considered fraudulent behavior. So there's a couple different ways that behavioral biometrics could benefit a call center. The first is that as you initially enter that interaction, you're probably being asked to type a claim number or other information onto your phone. So behavioral biometrics could build your profile to see how you're typing in that information into your phone. And then when you do get to a call center representative, it can help analyze those speech patterns, again, to make sure that when you're calling, it truly is you who is asking for the information. Another area that can hugely benefit from behavioral biometrics is financial institutions and their new account application process. So think about your banks or your credit cards. This is an enormous space for identity theft and opening fraudulent accounts, and this is on the rise. So even though this is a new account application, you think, oh, there should really be a profile for this, and there's not. These companies don't know their new customers quite yet. But behavioral biometrics can still distinguish between good and bad actors, specifically if there was, say, a bot trying to open an application. It can analyze that typing speed, those swipe patterns and mouse clicks, and really just make sure that the entity that is submitting the application is in fact human. And this is something that could potentially save millions of dollars for financial institutions. So there's really a huge opportunity here. So then we get into our benefits. So we have our layered security. This is more reliable than really any other method of authentication. Physiological traits are very difficult to imitate, especially when it's, say, a machine trying to imitate a human. Um, And so this is something where it creates reduced friction. So it runs in the background, it's constantly collecting the data, and it changes over time. And this is something that can help us because we're just inundated with passwords and passcodes, and it can be really annoying when some of those things maybe aren't as quick as we want them to be. Maybe that two-factor authentication email didn't come through quick enough. And then the other piece of this is that because it does change with us over time, um, it means that we're not having to take action to update our accounts. It's just simply updating who we are based on what we do. And this is important because humans aren't really static. They change with time, we age, our patterns and behaviors do change, but they don't tend to change very quickly. So when there's quick changes, that could potentially be a red flag. Now that does bring us into some challenges. So there is that area of compliance and making sure that user agreement is obtained. This is something that can be maybe a little concerning for some. It's strange to think that something is logging every tiny thing that you do, and that can be hard to understand. And so there's also that piece where there needs to be conversations and clarity and transparency around what rights consumers have to that data and then how it can be used by companies that are collecting it. And then the other piece comes around false positives and negatives. So let's say, for example, you've experienced a life event or you're no longer physically or mentally capable of handling your own accounts. So you are assigned or have a power of attorney. So obviously that power of attorney's behavioral biometrics are going to be very different from yours. So when these sudden changes occur, how do people that need access to those accounts access those accounts? So that's a question that will need to be worked through. And then again, when it's sudden, so maybe you have an accident or a stroke that severely impacts your movements to a point where maybe those biometrics are no longer recognized. How do those people continue to access their accounts and have that seamless experience? So in the end, behavioral biometrics is a growing field that promises to reduce fraudulent activity while providing a seamless and frictionless user experience. There's a lot of challenges to overcome, but its benefits far outweigh those challenges. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on behavioral biometrics. If you want to check out any of my resources, feel free to go to these different articles. They were very interesting. Thank you and have a good night.